Welcome to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to start off by reminding you of the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. Now, this week, we're going to transition, and we're going to move from the problems that we have with random mutation and natural selection not being able to explain the beginnings of new species or functions or body parts or things like that, over to the problem of irreducible complexity. And I want to walk us through and kind of define what these things are, as we've been talking about Darwin's example of the human eye. And we'll start with that and putting that on the table. Again, this is going back to the origin of species. Darwin said the simplest organ which can be called an eye consists of an optic nerve surrounded by pigmented cells and covered by translucent skin, but without any lens or other refractive body. Okay, so I want you to think about that for a minute, because what we're talking about here, obviously you would have to have a brain. You'd have to have a nerve coming off of that. So the optic nerve is feeding information into a brain. And that's essentially how your eye works. You have an eye. That eye is sending information to the optic nerve, which is then being processed over into useful information inside your mind. And that's why sight is a good thing, obviously. I don't know where else to go with that. But as you look at that, and as we think about that, I want you to consider for a minute all of the different moving parts that we have inside of that. Now, he identifies three, and let's talk about why all three are important. Now, first, he identifies an optic nerve, an optic nerve, and he indicates how a nerve comes to be sensitive to light hardly concerns us more than how life itself originated. Talked about how problematic of a theory that is a few weeks ago, that the person who wrote the book, The Origin of Species, does not care how life originated. That seems to be an oxymoron of all oxymorons, but whatever, we'll go forward with it. So his indication is that in this early creature, light sensitivity, a light-sensitive optic nerve, a light-sensitive nerve that is then transmitting data, is the initial starting point that we have. Now, when you think about that, again, you have to get rid of the concept of the eyes that you have right now. When you think about it, I raised the issue last week. I don't understand the usefulness of light sensitivity as it relates to this. That is pointed to oftentimes, and Darwin himself pointed to it, is that, look, you can see certain creatures that don't really have eyes that have light sensitivity. Okay, that may be true, but what benefit does it serve them? It doesn't really help them in a meaningful way. And the chasm between light sensitivity and useful information in terms of vision, again, requires intelligence. I don't know how you get past that chasm. And the idea that we can just jump past it is going to assume a lot of other parts operating and functioning in our eye that are going to need to randomly mutate and evolve on their own as well. But when we think about that, we start to look at those three body parts that he identifies. And the reason they become important become obvious pretty quickly. So we have the light-sensitive nerve. We have pigmented cells covered by translucent skin. Well, the reason you're going to need to have those pigmented cells is, again, future development of other parts that he's envisioning that we have within our eye. And translucent skin covering it, we can see with our own eyes right now. The problem that you've got is if you don't cover that up with something, let's say it's here on your arm, and you have a light-sensitive nerve on your arm, well, it's going to have to be it's going to have to be outside of the skin to be of any use. I mean, light sensitivity through our skin might be one thing, but you can't see through skin. So again, he specifically mentions translucent skin. So skin that's going to let light go through it and eventually become something like the eyes that we have that lets everything come through. All of that vision, all of the colors and the lights and everything else that we see that our eyes are able to decipher into useful information that's transmitted to our eye. All of that has got to happen at some ill-defined point in the future. But he sets those three up, and the reason they're going to be important is if you have a nerve sticking out of your arm that's translating information, or even if it's sticking out of your noggin someplace, it's going to be damaged very quickly. And even if you get the pigmented cells, which was his next addition to the list, unless you cover it pretty quickly, it's not going to transmit useful information. And eventually it's going to be damaged very quickly and not be of much use to the creature. You think about if your eyes didn't have any protection, if you didn't have these eyelids covering them frequently, how long would your eyes actually last? You jump into a swimming pool and boom, the impact of jumping into the swimming pool is going to be enough to do you in a lot of cases. So you've got to have some protection there. You've got to have protection, though, that allows for vision to come in. You've got to have all these different things. Darwin takes an enormous number of liberties putting these three things on the table. That these three things are just that. They just happen. It's fine and it's easy. That was why I mentioned 2 or 3 episodes ago that he's not starting at the bottom of Mount Improbable, Richard Dawkins' parable. He's starting partway up the mountain. He's already skipped part of the journey, and what he puts on the table as the most basic eye, he doesn't explain how it got there. And again, we've talked about how that's problematic. So last time we talked about, again, a couple of these issues. We talked about how random mutation is going to require obvious problems that really we don't see mutation ever do. We've talked previously about the idea that you need the idea, that you need vision is a concept that has got to move forward, and the fact that the concept of vision has to then eventually be recognized by a blind approach just boggles the mind. And within our experience, we don't see anything like that, that something as useful as vision could have just happened all on its own. Nowhere in life do we see that. But now we're going to run into the next problem. And in the next problem, what you've got to start pulling together is all of these different parts have to come together. Let's say you have translucent skin somewhere else on the creature. How does it specifically and conveniently cover the eye? Maybe the whole creature's covered with it. You know, he points out, I think in his book, he points to some of these animals that live in total darkness that have some light sensitivity, that much of their skin is like that. Okay, fine. Let's grant that. But you're going to have to start putting those things together in a very specific order to actually get them to work usefully. And once the random mutation has happened, and this is the catch, random mutation might, I contend that it can't, but let's allow to keep the discussion moving. Let's say random mutation explains how these things began. The optic nerve, the pigmented cells, and the translucent skin. Let's say random mutation can explain all three of those things. Random mutation cannot explain putting them all together. It just simply can't. Now, we can hope for luck. We can hope for luck to get us there. But this is fundamentally a problem that we have going forward, and this is the idea of irreducible complexity. The first time I was exposed to this was in Lee Strobel's book, The Case for a Creator, and he interviewed Dr. Michael Behe on this topic. Dr. Behe from his book, Darwin's Black Box. And I want to quote from that, from Lee Strobel's book, because I think this is a really great definition of the problem of irreducible complexity. So let's go with that for a minute. You see, a system or device is irreducibly complex if it has a number of different components, that all work together to accomplish the task of the system. And if you were to remove one of the components, the system would no longer function. An irreducibly complex system is highly unlikely to be built piece by piece through Darwinian processes, because the system has to be fully present in order for it to function. Okay, you've got an example here I'm putting over my shoulder, and what Dr. Behe normally gives us his first example would be a mousetrap. And you can see your basic mousetrap. It's a piece of wood, you've got a spring loaded on it, you've got the little metal bar that flips, and you've got the little piece there that holds the cheese. And the cheese triggers the release of the spring. The spring brings the piece of metal over, which traps the mouse. If you take away and a mousetrap is one of the most simple inventions that we possibly have, but it's very useful if you live in an area where mice are a problem. If you remove any one single part, do you have a functioning mousetrap? No. You have a collection of wood and metal that does you no good, and a little piece of cheese that eventually goes bad, or peanut butter, whichever you prefer to use. To put them all together, cannot be explained through natural purposes. No one would look at a mousetrap and go, gosh, I wonder how that happened. The answer is easy. A human being built a factory, and the factory produced a mousetrap. And an engineer somewhere has a machine that moves a little piece of wood, puts all the little parts together, and boom, on the other side, out comes the mousetrap. We talked about this a few weeks ago when we were talking about the idea of those great examples you see on TV of potato chip plants and things like that. The intelligence that goes into those things is remarkable. But at some point, as you begin combining all of these component parts, natural selection on its own has no explanatory ability, nor does random mutation, for how a group of complex working parts come together to form a machine. And that is going to be something that is hugely problematic. Now, Richard Dawkins tries to point at this as an example of we're just using God of the gaps. I'll quote from The God Delusion. Searching for particular examples of irreducible complexity is a fundamentally unscientific way to proceed, a case of arguing from present ignorance. Gaps shrink as science advances. I appreciate that remark. That is absolutely incorrect, however. We are not talking about situations where we go, there is no way that that could have happened, therefore God must have done it. That's not what we're talking about here. In our experience, let's talk again about the mousetrap idea. In our experience, when we recognize multiple inner working parts, when those parts come together to perform a specific function, have we ever experienced a situation where that happened naturally through a randomized process? No. 100% of the time, that is the handiwork of intelligence. 100% of the time. When we look at a telescope does not come together through a random process of pieces of glass falling into place in a metal or plastic tube somewhere. That is never the case. Telescopes are put together piece by piece when you look at that. Darwin recognized this, and this is one of the things he's trying to get past here in this argument around the eye. Remember, he said, to suppose that the eye, with all of its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, and for the correction of spherical chromatic aberration, could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. So he's looking at all of these interconnected working body parts within the eye, and he says, I recognize that to believe that all of this could have just happened, all of the parts being put together specifically to work this way, I admit freely that seems problematic. So he tries to go back and explain it going forward. The problem that he runs into is, he said, well, a very simplistic eye, we have no trouble understanding how that could proceed step by step forward. The problem is slowing the process down doesn't help him. Later on, he says, it has been objected that in order to modify the eye and still preserve it as a perfect instrument, many changes would have to be effected simultaneously, which it is assumed could not be done through natural selection. But as I have attempted to show in my work on the variation of domestic animals, it is not necessary to suppose that the modification were all simultaneous if they were extremely slight and gradual. Slowing it down doesn't help. What his critics rightly attributed to him as a problem that he kind of glossed over and moved past in all of this is, okay, fine. You make this argument about a simple eye. There's nothing simple about this. And to go from this idea of, well, a light-sensitive patch and some pigmented skin and a translucent cover could eventually become this. This is what his critics pointed to and went, that doesn't get you there. You might have an extremely antiquated eye. You might have something like that. But to get to something like what we have, there are far too many complex working parts in there. And the problem becomes, as you move forward, each successive jump in what's supposed to be natural selection can't explain the perfection that we ultimately have. My ability to be able to focus, granted, admittedly needs glasses now and it didn't used to, but my ability to be able to recognize color, to recognize and focus in on objects, to be able to see in both the light and the dark, and for my eye to be able to adjust to those things. I've got a really good camera in the other room that I used to use that I'm not using for recording anymore. And that camera has been damaged a couple of times, and while it's been repaired, it's never functioned quite the same because it is such an enormously complex working group of parts put together. And this is the problem that natural selection is going to have as we go forward. When you look at these body parts, his jump partway up Mount Improbable gets him past the problem of the eye, but in my opinion, it's never going to get you to a complex eye. The problem that we're going to have very quickly is there are so many body parts and then systems within our body that defy explanation that natural selection and random mutation are not going to be able to touch them. In our experience, we know and recognize that a group of complex parts put together in a specific way to accomplish a specific task is always the handiwork of intelligence. What we are going to recognize going forward is that is going to be the case over and over again. And on the next episode, because I don't want this episode to go too long, we're going to jump into one of the most obscure examples out there, but I think it just does tremendous damage to Darwin's theory when we talk about balance and how it is that we're able to balance in a three-dimensional space as we go forward. I want to thank you for joining us. We're going to stop this week, and next week we're going to jump into some examples of irreducible complexity. We're going to start with some body part examples and functions, and then we're going to work into systems in our body because these examples, I think, utterly destroy Darwin's theory as we go forward. That, however, is where we're going to end today. Thank you so much for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode, I hope you'll consider hitting the like button for the podcast and the subscribe button for the like button for the episode, and the subscribe button for the podcast. You can find our podcasts on YouTube, iTunes, and Spotify. And you can reach out to us on our website via email at prooftograce@yahoo.com. You can find us on our website at prooftograce.com. Thank you for joining us. And I hope as we take this journey, I hope you'll step back and be impressed by you. I hope you'll be impressed by the care and attention and love that were put into making you. And I hope we get to a place where everybody can recognize that the best answer, the best explanation for how we got here is the loving hand of a creator who loved you so very much, he gave everything for you. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.